Welcome to Crimeroom, a true crime podcast. I'm the speaker, and my name is X. It doesn't matter who I am, it only matters what they did. Join us. Enter the room.
Crimeroom is designed for mature audiences and is unsuitable for young or sensitive listeners. Discretion is strongly advised.
On June 24th, 2008, newspaper headlines in the small town of Kisovo, in the western part of the Republic of Macedonia, indicated a certain trend was beginning to form. A famous local journalist had been documenting and investigating murders in the town. His stories were interesting and intriguing to readers far and wide, and it wasn't long before the hard-working journalist made a name for himself. He was the first to discover there was a Macedonian serial killer on the prowl who was out to strike again. While this caused an increase in public fear and desperation, it helped the local newspaper business as more and more copies were sold. Kisovo is a small town of about 27,000 inhabitants, occupying a valley just below Mount Bistra between Obrid and Gostivar. It is known for its peacefulness. The majority of Kisovo's residents are Christians, the neighbourhood is quiet, and the residents are friendly with one another. It was a happy day for Mr. and Mrs. Taneski when Mrs. Taneski gave birth to a bouncing baby boy in 1952. He had dark hair and brown eyes. He was named Vlado. Vlado was a sweet little boy who was the pride of his parents. He was obedient and made good grades. In church, he was the perfect example of devout, even from a young age. The neighbours always compared their kids to him, and his parents would frequently hear phrases like, "Vlado would never do such a thing like this." He was a dream child. Mrs. Garcia Taneski loved her boy so much. She wanted to keep him from the darkness of society, and he was always cooperative. Vlado knew right from wrong, said his prayers, never asked for too much, did the dishes immediately after eating, and never waited to be told what to do. Vlado made raising a child so easy for Mr. and Mrs. Taneski. They were so proud of him because everywhere they went, they got good reports back. Life was everything they had prayed for and hoped it would be. However, things began to change in 1965 when Vlado turned 13 years old. Mrs. Taneski knew the people whispered behind her back and looked at her strangely when she went to church and work meetings. She didn't understand exactly what it was, but she knew that something wasn't right. It was even more frustrating that nobody was willing to tell her what the gossiping was about. She asked her neighbours and colleagues, especially the teenagers she worked with, as she knew they had a way of knowing things heard through the grapevine. She asked the three young teens she knew, Miltra, Savannah and Lubica. Miltra didn't know what Mrs. Taneski was talking about. Savannah just kept mute, shook her head and walked away. And Lubica, she was the youngest of them all. She claimed that nobody told her anything, but if she found out she would let Mrs. Taneski know. Things were becoming too stressful for Mrs. Taneski. She could feel that all was not well, and she knew that it had something to do with herself or her family. Since the answer would not come from the outside, she decided to check within. Mrs. Taneski confronted her husband with infidelity. She accused him of going after a lady living just down the street. The one Mrs. Taneski claimed displayed her unmentionables for all to see. Mr. Taneski was taken aback, but he remained calm. He kept wondering what could have come over his wife, or what she might have heard to warrant such a heavy accusation. He was not a perfect man. He didn't make enough to give his family the best of things, but he did his best to make sure they never starved. He lied sometimes and loved food a lot. He was culpable of laziness, and sure, he drank too much sometimes. But cheating was something he had never thought of. He would never do anything to disregard his marital vows. Mrs. Taneski asked him one final time, to which her husband responded, "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know where this is coming from, but I never want to hear of it ever again." That was Mr. Taneski's quiet reply as he made up his mind to get to the root of the matter. But Mr. Taneski didn't need to figure anything out. As the next day, he woke up to his wife on her knees in tears. She was lamenting about how uncomfortable the last 4 months had been for her. The stares from the neighbours, the whispers in church, and all the odd things that were going on. She was sure something was wrong, and she was sure it had to do with her family. She admitted she had no basis for accusing him of being unfaithful, but that was all she could think of as the reason for the pitiful looks she so frequently received. Mr. Taneski asked his wife to get up and promised to look into the matter. Then came a knock on the door. Mr. Taneski wiped his wife's tears and told her to clean up while he went to get the door. Standing there and looking perplexed was Savannah, one of the teenagers Mrs. Taneski had approached about the rumours. Mr. Taneski invited her in. What Savannah had to say was nothing good, but it was the answer to the questions that had been burning in Mrs. Taneski's mind over the past months. She said that the girls, Milcher Lubica and herself, had decided to let Mrs. Taneski know what had been going on. Savannah explained plainly to the stunned couple the unfortunate new person their star child Vlado had become. Mrs. Taneski began to cry and tried to call her son down from his room, but got no answer. Savannah told Vlado's distraught mother that he, Vlado, had joined a local gang and everyone in the village knew about the gang and what they got up to. Mrs. Taneski quickly realised that her son had started changing long ago. She remembered that he did not frequent church as often as he used to, and always claimed to have one class project to do or another as an excuse for how he was spending his time. She also realised that for a while he had stopped making plans with the Reverend's son, and the headmistress's daughter too, which wasn't like him. Vlado had started hanging out with the youth on the street. His group of friends changed as he started spending more time with boys from his new gang. The gang was a group of 7 boys who were notorious for their truancy. They never went to school. They bullied other kids and collected their lunch money. They picked pockets and broke into stores on Sundays while the owners were out for church. The gang dealt in marijuana, cocaine and local tobacco. They were usually a prayer point for the elderly women at the local church. The news was shocking, but something had to be done, and fast. Mrs. Taneski was a conservative woman. She believed in God and cared about what society thought of her family, especially her son, the fruit of her womb. She was determined to deliver him from the clutches of the evil company he had started keeping. Mrs. Taneski did everything to portray him in a good light from then on. She brought him good clothes, ensured that he got into a better school than he was in before, and tried to control the kind of company he kept. Mrs. Taneski was so scared. She prayed to God for her son to change and did everything within her power to get her sweet boy back. Vlado, on the other hand, wanted to be free to do the things his friends were allowed to do. He wanted to wear ripped jeans, sag his pants, smoke weed, listen to vulgar lyrics, have sex, go to parties, and enjoy late nights. He wanted to be a teenager. Things began to change when Vlado was approaching 17 years old. He became withdrawn, stayed at home all the time and retreated to his room. His parents couldn't understand it, but it was better than hanging out with the gang, so they let him be. Vlado went through school and college like every other teenager and trained to become a journalist. All the while, Vlado's relationship with his mother remained tense. Vlado was not the only child. He had an elder brother who was disinherited when he left home. His parents ordered him never to return. His sister left home as well. Years and years went by, and Vlado settled into his quiet life as a news reporting journalist. He was a freelance journalist who got paid only when his articles were published. Things were not easy for him, as it was the communist era. He was reporting for the New Macedonia, but was let go as they considered him not good enough and old school. His way of writing was good. Vlado was very talented and better than most journalists, but his approach was dated. Vlado also wrote novels and published other books, poetry and stories. He never missed any information because of his deep knowledge of the town. Even when it was quiet, he had something to write. One summer evening, as Vlado took a stroll downtown, he heard a woman laugh. The sound calmed his nerves and he followed the voice into some nearby woods. Sitting among other girls was the most beautiful woman Vlado had ever set eyes on. He decided not to disturb their picnic and just waited back until they walked out from the trees to leave. Vlado walked up to the young woman and engaged her in a conversation. He offered to walk home with her, but she declined because he was a stranger. After much persuasion, she decided to leave him her phone number, but never told him her name. Vlado called the woman's number a week later. The pair had lunch and spent the rest of the day together. Sparks flew immediately. They kept going out for a few months, and one day she told him he was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Vlado professed his love for her shortly afterwards, and everything was working smoothly until some young men started making passes at her. She wasn't interested, and Vlado knew it, but he wasn't willing to take chances, so he decided to do what was proper. He proposed to her, she said yes, and they got married a few weeks later at the local church. Vlado was a sweet husband, he did right by his wife, and he was everything she had hoped he would be. 2 years later, they had their first child, the most beautiful innocent sight Vlado had laid his eyes on. He made a great husband and father. He was soft-spoken and always did what he could for his family. Work was going well. Vlado was an excellent journalist, and in the office, he never put his nose in what didn't concern him. He wasn't particularly close to any co-worker, but he had no issues with any of them either. About 3 years into their marriage, Vlado's wife had another child. Life was good. One evening, in 1990, Vlado heard a knock on his office door. His attention was urgently needed downtown. He quickly grabbed his jacket and suitcase and followed the messenger. Upon his arrival, there were police patrol cars in front of his father's house, and on a stretcher was a body in a body bag. He ran towards the body bag, but was held back by onlookers. When he was calm, the sheriff walked up to him and requested that he follow him. He joined the sheriff to where the body bag had been kept and saw that the body held inside it was his father's. Vlado and his father were not the best of friends, but they weren't at each other's throats either. It was still his father. It really hurt. It hurt Vlado even more when he learned his father had committed suicide. The police asked Vlado some questions about why Mr. Taneski would have chosen to take his own life, but there were no clues. After his father's suicide, things worsened between Vlado and his mother. They argued over everything, and sometimes Vlado became aggressive. When things got worse, he moved out of his childhood family home to a place his own family could call their own. In addition, things started changing in his marriage. His wife didn't seem to understand him anymore, and his kids were scared of him. She was forced to go to the capital to look for work. The marriage had broken down. And so, after 31 years of matrimony, Vlado was separated from his wife, the mother of his 2 children, and she took the children with her. One evening, after Vlado and his wife had separated, Vlado got a phone call. He was beckoned home right away to his parents' house. His mother was dying and urgently needed to see him. Vlado decided to honour the invitation. However, by the time he got there, she had already passed on. The burial arrangements were set in motion, the church bore the cost of laying Mrs. Taneski to rest, and life continued for Vlado. Vlado sunk into his work, reporting on crime at the New Macedonian newspaper, where his co-workers described him as low-key and soft-spoken. At home, Vlado was reserved. He never spoke to anyone, not even his next-door neighbour Zoran, who described him as secretive and mysterious, as they never had much as a hello to say to each other. Another neighbour said he was a strange type, unsociable and unfriendly. Christmas came and went, and the New Year celebrations welcomed in 2003. That year, the town's peace was abruptly disrupted one day when Mrs. Gorica Pavleska, an old cleaner who lived alone, went missing mysteriously. She was about 78 years old and was well known around the town. Many weeks later, there was still no news and no clues about the jolly 78-year-old old lady Pavleska, her whereabouts or her condition. Lubica Lakoska had no formal education, but she did her best to earn a living to sustain herself and her kids. She was a cleaner, just as Vlado's mother was. She was also a peaceful person who went about her business and did her job diligently. From time to time, as a teenager, Lubica was seen talking with Vlado's mother, and they became friends. In the same town was another woman, Mitra Simjanowska. She was also an uneducated woman, and just as Lubica did, she cleaned for a living. Then there was Zivana Telmokoska. She was soft-spoken and conservative like Mrs. Taneski. She was also an illiterate cleaner who worked hard cleaning houses and offices to keep her home. 2 years had passed, and old lady Pavleska had not been found, dead or alive. It was soon to be forgotten, a thing of the past, when something more shocking happened. Mitra Simjanowska went missing on November 16, 2004. There were no signs of forced entry or any violent struggle, which suggested that she knew and trusted her abductor. Mitra would not be found until 2 months later, on January 12, 2005, when her body was found naked, wrapped in a plastic bag and put in a hole at the bottom of a steel stanchion, which is part of a new sports centre, still under construction. When she was found, Mitra's legs were tied up with telephone cable and she was placed in an upright position. She was covered in old clothes, dirt, waste material, and some heavy stones. From their investigations and observations, the police concluded that Mitra had been raped and eventually strangled to death with a telephone cord. This was another strange occurrence for the people of Kisevo. It was the savage way Mitra had been killed that caused so much shock and fear for the townsfolk and surrounding regions as word began to spread. Vlado's journalism career witnessed a big lift as he delved into crime-focused reports. He started writing intriguing and revealing newspaper articles about the death that had occurred of his late mother's friend, Mitra Simjanowska. He was known as the journalist with the inside scoop. Everybody in Kisevo looked forward to the centre page of the New Macedonian newspaper because of the nature of the information Vlado revealed in his column. His report on the last death in town was epic. It was highly informative, taking every little piece of information into account. It was so detailed that people could easily have imagined how Mitra Simjanowska had died and what her last moments must have felt like. His work appealed to the public's innate morbid fascination, and his employers were proud of Vlado's outstanding work. The police wondered if Vlado may have known who the murderer was, but kept it to himself in order to make money and gain a following from his inside knowledge. Some of the neighbours concluded that Vlado probably had such a vivid imagination when covering how the women had died because of the amazing similarities that she shared with his mother. The victim's physical appearance and career were just like Mrs. Taneski's had been. Although the story seemed to be a little sensationalised, nobody made a big deal out of the articles. In fact, some people commended Vlado for his creative and investigative abilities. As time went on, Vlado started working with the police to cover the murders. He also started writing for different newspapers. He collaborated with different editors in different news companies, and with time his name became a household name in Macedonia. The Minister of Interior had ordered that the police take in suspects and carry out investigations. They did this, but didn't discover any solid leads. It was during this time that Vlado revealed in an article that the police had implicated 2 men for the murders of the victims. However, the said men were incarcerated at the time the murders took place. This put further pressure on the police. Vlado was scrutinising their efforts, and the public were demanding they solve the cases. With time, Mitra was buried and Kosovo moved on from her passing. After all, something more distracting had come up yet again: the elections. There were controversies between political groups which led to protests on the streets of Kosovo. The whole town was waiting with bated breath for the outcome of the elections. Finally, word came. After the elections and jubilations, things had returned to normal again, and all was well, or at least better than things had been in the past months. However, this was not to last for long. 2 young men went and committed a heinous crime in 2006 and broke into an old man's house to rob it, but they were drunk and drugged, so they lost control. They raped the old man, beat him and killed him. They were caught and charged to court. At this time, Vlado was a courtroom reporter, and he had assumed his usual position in the courtroom. At the end of the trial, the court found the 2 young men guilty of the death of the older man they had robbed, and that of Mitra, as the mode of torture in both murders was similar. They both received exceptionally long sentences upon conviction. Vlado reported that during their statements to the court, the accused young men had agreed to torturing and killing the old man and described it as a mistake. However, they totally denied having anything to do with Mitra's death. Vlado also interviewed members of the local community to get as many details as he could so that he could write more. Things seemed to have returned to normal, but the next year, Vlado called his news desk claiming to have received a shocking revelation. He informed the local police on November 10th of 2007 that another woman, Lubica Lakoska, had gone missing. This was the second female victim. She had left her home about 200 yards from Vlado's house to get groceries at the local supermarket for her family, but she never made it to her destination. At the news of the second death, the entire town was in shock and the police were confused. There were already people serving sentences whom they presumed to be the serial killers. Lubica was described by a former colleague as calm and hard-working. According to the colleague, Lubica was cleaning houses close to her own, and she even noted Vlado's home to be one of the houses that Lubica serviced. Vlado wrote in one of his articles that Lubica had been abducted when she was lured into the car a previous night by some men who told her that her son was injured and that they could bring her to him. The community searched for her until February the following year. In February 2008, the local police found her dead body wrapped in transparent plastic sheeting, exactly like her dead colleague's corpse had been found. Just like Mitra, she had been raped, molested, beaten, and strangled with a phone cable. She was found at the foot of a mountain. She had several broken ribs, bruises and lacerations on her head, and traces of sperm found on the body indicated sexual assault. The town was awed again by all the little gory details Vlado provided about the death. Nobody was worried about the precision of Vlado's writing, but one person was disturbed by the detailed descriptions and almost convinced the reporter had killed Lubica himself. According to Lubica's sister, one of the pieces of clothing found in her dead sister's body was something she recognised as having belonged to Vlado. Vlado was also a neighbour. Nothing was done about it, as the community considered this to be gossip or hearsay. The police had another unsolved case on their hands, and their competence was now under scrutiny. The people decided that the police could no longer protect them. If they could not prevent a crime, they should at least be able to apprehend the culprits of past atrocities and bring them to justice. One summer evening, on May 7, 2008, there was a phone call in Vlado Taneski's home. She received a phone call telling her that her son had been in an accident and there were no witnesses. This was seemingly true, as such information had been announced on the local radio, a radio station to which Vlado supplied news reports. After the phone call, she hurried out of the house. Neighbours saw her moving towards the hospital in a rush with worry on her face. Zoran was Mrs. Taneski's son. He could not tell where she had gone to or who she had been with. The call was a hoax all along. Zoran was fine. What was even more vague about Savannah's abduction was that there had been no call for help or any scream heard by neighbours. The next day, her mobile phone was found. About a week later, on May 18, 2008, Vlado Taneski was discovered naked and dead, wrapped in a plastic bag at a rubbish dump. Just like her murdered friends, she had been raped, beaten and strangled. She had been disposed of near a football field on the outskirts of town. This cast some doubt in the minds of police about the various suspects' involvement in the murders because they were in police custody during this time. As usual, Vlado wrote about this murder in the most detailed way one could imagine. He described Savannah's dead body graphically in his May 19th article and added that she had been tied up with a phone cable, which had apparently been used to murder her. The police began to question Vlado's sources. All the victims were familiar with and probably trusted their killer, as there were no reports of cries for help, or screams, or any other indication of fear or danger. They also believed that the killer was able to subdue the women and strong enough to dispose of their dead bodies. It was also clear that the same killer was responsible for all the deaths. In other words, they had a serial killer in town, just like Vlado's headlines had stated earlier. One evening, a police officer on the case had just finished his shift and decided to breeze into the local pub for a beer. While he was there, he heard the locals talking. One of them was praising the great journalist Vlado Taneski for his ability to reveal facts to the public, which the police had kept hidden. He went on to say that with his great investigative abilities, Vlado alone could solve the murders. That's when it hit the officer. He paid for his drink and left the pub. He went straight to his office, rifled through files, and discovered that no one had been told that the type of cords used to strangle the victims came from telephones. Nor had it been revealed that the cords were left at the crime scene. But Vlado had included these and more details unknown to the public in his articles. Vlado Taneski was the only one who knew and wrote about the number of times Savannah was stabbed. Not even the police revealed that. The police officer spent the night comparing facts and situations, the details in the police files and the details in the articles. It dawned on him that maybe, just maybe, Vlado had witnessed these murders. Motive also seemed to exist because every time there was a murder, Vlado's career received a boost. The next day, the police officer hurried home, had a shower, drank some coffee and went to work. He discussed his observations with his boss, who directed that Vlado be called in for questioning. Questions gave rise to the need to investigate him further, as he became a strong suspect for the murder of 2 of the 3 deceased women. His summer house, as well as his cottage in a nearby village, were searched, and the police discovered a huge collection of pornographic magazines and videos, as well as sheets of paper containing murder notes where he had documented the murders of the victims. Vlado's semen sample was taken and tested against the one found on the dead women. They were a match. Further investigation revealed that Vlado had visited the victims' family members after each death to learn intimate details about them for his articles. Lubika's sister had expressed her shock at the discovery of Vlado as the murderer. Zoran, Savannah's son, was also shocked to know that his neighbour had been responsible for his mother's death because Vlado had asked for details after the murder. After interviewing over 250 suspects, the police finally arrested Vlado Taneski and he was charged in court on June 22, 2008 with the murders of Mitra and Lubica. Although suspected of being behind old lady Pavleska's disappearance, without a body, the police had little evidence to charge Vlado for that crime. The court, located in northwestern Gostivar, ordered that he be remanded in the Tetovo prison for 30 days to enable further investigation. Finally, the culprit was caught and peace could return to Kisovo. On the 23rd of June 2008, the day after Vlado's arrest, one of the Tetovo prison officials was patrolling when he discovered an open toilet. He called out to know who was in there, but got no response. He decided to check for himself, and to his horror, found Vlado Taneski was bent over a bucket of water in one of the prison toilets with his head completely submerged. His cellmates reported that apparently Vlado had committed suicide, but the position of the small bucket of shallow water and the angle of Vlado's body was more than suspicious. Meanwhile, the whereabouts of old lady Pavleska remains an unsolved mystery. The police and local community still have important unanswered questions they may never resolve. Thank you for listening to episode 6 of Crime Room. Join us next time. I'm the speaker, and my name is X.
If you enjoy listening to Crime Room, please give the show a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. Crime Room is available now on iTunes, Stitcher and Spotify. Make sure to subscribe for notifications when new episodes are released. Sign up to the Crime Room newsletter or submit show suggestions at crimeroompodcast.com. That's crimeroompodcast.com. Crime Room is narrated by X. Additional voicing by Matthew O'Reilly Kavanagh. This episode was written by Sandra Chikura. Produced by Rachel McDermott. Scored and mixed by Andrew Lynn. The Crime Room theme song is by Sarah Sherlock.